Order.
Draft Heat Networks Market Framework Great Britain Regulations 2025.
I call the Minister to submit the motion.
Thank you, Chair. Honourable Members, I beg to move that the Draft Heat Network Market Framework Great Britain Regulations 2025, which were laid before the House on the 28th of November 2024, be approved. As heat networks have not yet been debated in this Parliament, I want to say a few words about the context in which this regulation sits. 23% of the United Kingdom's carbon emissions comes from heating buildings. So decarbonising heat is key to reaching both our net zero commitments and reducing our reliance on international fossil fuels as we sprint to clean power by 2030. Heat pumps and heat networks are two principal technologies we believe for achieving this. We believe heat networks will be key to reducing bills for the next generation. Their energy can be drawn from large, efficient heat pumps or even from heat that would otherwise be dumped into the air, such as from data centres and waste incinerations. Proven internationally to provide affordable, low-carbon heat, heat networks are especially suited to dense urban areas. The government therefore expects that about 20% of the UK's heat demand will be met by heat networks by 2050, up from 3% today. And I have visited Mersey Heat in Liverpool and saw firsthand the huge potential of heat networks, not just to benefit consumers, but critically to regenerate our urban centres. However, alongside growing the market for heat networks, we also need to ensure that for 470,000 households currently supplied by heat networks today, many and future households that will be connected, people are able to receive a fair deal as the market grows. One of the biggest barriers that heat networks are inconsistently regulated. As people on heat networks cannot change their suppliers, heat networks are in effect a monopoly with a captive market, which makes it harder to ensure that consumers are treated fairly. Through lots of conversations with consumer groups and through government commission research, we can identify gaps where the current market is not providing for consumers a fair service. Heating is less reliable, suppliers are less transparent, and it is harder for consumers to represent themselves or make complaints. The current situation is clearly intolerable. These are not just consumers, but people trying to keep themselves healthy and warm, trying to live their lives. When I spoke to the UK Association of Decentralised Energy in October, I spoke to them of the need to ensure that these people at the very heart of the energy transition that we need to make and at the very heart of the way that we think about heat networks. The Energy Act 2023 provides powers for the Secretary of State to introduce regulations across Great Britain which will protect heat network consumers in a way that is comparable to other regulated utilities. This instrument today is the first step in introducing this regulatory framework. This statutory instrument introduces an authorisation regime to be implemented by Ofgem. This will work in a similar way to the gas and electricity licensing regimes that Ofgem already regulates. It takes an outcome-based approach to reflect heat networks' diversity of scale and their nascent market position. The regulations ban running a heat network without authorisation. Existing heat networks are automatically given an authorisation to phase in market regulation. The conditions for authorisation are set by either the Secretary of State or Ofgem and apply rules for running a heat network. Ofgem will be able to monitor compliance regulations and act where appropriate. Actions Ofgem can take include issuing information notices for compliance data, investigating suspected non-compliance, inspecting commercial premises, and issuing a range of orders requiring remedial action. Consumer redress orders can also be issued, requiring that affected consumers are given compensation. These regulations require Ofgem to publish statements of policy on how powers are used. Penalties will be proportionate to the authorised person's size and the scale of harm their non-compliance has caused. Additionally, this instrument gives Ofgem powers to set standards of performance for heat networks, determining minimum performance level service provision for consumers.
Would the Minister give way?
Yes.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, and heat networks, do you think, have a significant part to play, like her visited ones around the country. Can she tell us, she told us about what she expects heat network contribution to be in 2050. Can she tell us what she expects it to be in 2030 and what steps are being taken now to encourage, other than changing the regulatory environment, to drive the take-up of more
Thank you to the Honourable Member. Look, we are running at the rollout of heat networks. We want to get to 20%. For me, that is a kind of minimum full that we're trying to get to by 2050. And we want to make huge progress in this Parliament. That means getting the investment framework right. So we're talking to industry at the moment and thinking about what investment looks like so that we can scale up investment in the UK. We are trying to create a regime whereby local authorities can work in a coordinated way in order to incentivise heat networks roll out within their patch, and critically we're putting in the regulatory framework, because in the end we need consumers, whether that is commercial consumers or domestic consumers, to have faith and confidence that heat networks will deliver for them. So the strategy instrument we're putting in today is absolutely critical to that, showing that actually if you have a heat network, it is not just good for you in terms of heating your homes, but critically it is also good for your pockets.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way, and appreciate her enthusiasm. I wonder if she could put any kind of number on what she's expecting to happen this year, the coming years between now and 2030, because 2050 is a long way off. I would like to know what the actual trajectory is and aim and priority of the government is now.
Thank you to the Honourable Gentleman. I would love to give a number, but because it's not fully in our gift, because in the end we're working with industry partners in order to get to the scale that we want to, I will refrain from doing that at the moment. But please be absolutely reassured that we are trying to run at pace, because I see the huge potential of heat networks. I think they are a way in which we can not only decarbonise our urban centres, but fundamentally lower bills for large numbers of consumers. So we are doing everything that we can to reassure industry, to put in place incentives, and to critically make sure that we have a regulatory framework that absolutely works for industries and works for consumers, so that we can get to that 20% sooner rather than later. Let me say a little bit about parts 1 and 2 of the instrument and how it applies to parts 1 and 2 of the Consumer Estates Agents and Redress Act, with some modifications to apply to these heat networks. These create the roles of consumer advocacy bodies for heat network consumers, which will be absolutely key, providing access to advice. It also extends, critically, the Energy Ombudsman Redress Scheme to these consumers. The regulation automatically enrolls all heat networks into the scheme. Members may note that the commencement date for some of the provisions are slightly different. This is because delays to the passage of the Energy Act means that Ofgem cannot commence regulatory activities before January 2026. Now, to ensure that heat network consumers are afforded some support before this, because we know that this is absolutely critical, we are establishing the roles of consumer advocacy, advice and redress schemes providers earlier in April 2025. Finally, this instrument makes amendments to the Heat Network Act 2021. These amendments were made to ensure that Ofgem can regulate consistently across Great Britain. In making these changes, my department consulted extensively with their counterparts in the Scottish Government to reach agreement with these amendments. The contents of these regulations are based off 2 consultations. A consultation creating a market framework in 2022 and a second one on consumer protection in 2023. Across both consultations, broad support for the structures created in this instrument were expressed. The content of the authorisation conditions are still being consulted on, the outcomes of which will be published before the authorisation regime commences. And to end, let me just say this. This instrument, for me, is the first step to introducing a comprehensive regulation to the heat network market. I'm absolutely committed to ensuring robust consumer protections across the energy sector, because we have to maintain the confidence and the trust of consumers. Heat networks have a huge potential to transform clean power. I'm sure everyone in this room agrees. And delivering cheap and efficient heat across the country is an absolute priority. These regulations will begin to pave the way for a fairer industry that does not grow at the cost of consumers. Thank you, Chair.
The question is, the committee has considered the draft Heat Networks Market Framework Great Britain Regulations 2025. I call the Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Twigg. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. It's a great pleasure to be back at another delegated legislation committee. I'm thinking about getting a camp bed and just staying on this corridor for the rest of the year. We've been accused, as His Majesty's official opposition, of seemingly opposing things for opposition's sake of late. And, of course, we had the uncomfortable moment when my speech from last year was quoted back to me verbatim by the Minister opposite in such a committee last week. However, this morning that is not going to be the case, because we welcome this move to regulate the heat networks market, which hitherto has been largely unregulated. Currently, heat networks users have fewer rights and diminished customer protections compared with other utility consumers. Despite being an essential utility, existing legislation covers only issues pertaining to metering and billing usage. So we welcome the consumer protections which this legislation entails. Consumers and bill payers are at the crux of our energy systems, and changes must be made in their best interest. I believe that this is the case, and that this change is indeed in their best interest. In this instance, consumers stand to benefit. However, sadly, this doesn't seem to be the case with the government's other energy policies and energy policy more widely. We're not seeing the £300 saving in energy bills as promised in the election campaign. We're seeing a ruinous over-reliance on renewables, with wind generating just 0.7% of UK's energy demand today. The boiler tax, which Labour MPs waved through Parliament last week, the employers' NIC increases, which will see wages depressed and employment dampened. Households and consumers rarely seem to be the focus of this government when it comes to making policy, but today this is not the case. And in the heat network market, the consumer stands to benefit from the introduction of this regulatory framework. As the market for heat network expands, the risk of exploitation of consumers becomes much more pertinent. It is therefore right that legislation is brought to remedy this gap in line with the frameworks which regulate gas and electricity markets. So to conclude, Mr Twiggs, I will not detain the committee long. We absolutely support the regulation of the heat networks market for the sake and the protection of consumers from exorbitant charges. I therefore do not wish to stand in the way of the legislation today and would strongly encourage the government to prioritise bill paying consumers across the rest of their energy policy moving forward, so that we can be again in a place where I am not opposing for opposition's sake, as I was accused of last week. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you to honourable members for their valuable contribution to this debate. It is great to see that there is cross-party consensus on this important piece of regulation. What I would say is that at the heart of this approach has been putting consumers front and centre of what we're trying to do in the energy transition. And I reassure the House that this is not unique to heat networks. This is the approach that we are taking in every realm of the heat transition and the energy transition as we sprint to clean power by 2030. And what, for me, is absolutely key is that the regulations that we will introduce today begin that process of ensuring that heat network consumers, both existing and future heat consumers, get a fair deal. I'm seeing in my constituency, I've spoken to honourable members across the House and their constituencies where that is not the case at the moment. And so we absolutely need to move at pace in order to ensure that. I'm excited about the potential of heat networks and what I believe that they can achieve for the country, both in terms of people's pockets, but critically regenerating our urban areas. And I hope the level of consensus that we've achieved in the room today is one that continues for future debates as we move into other areas of the energy transition.
The question is the committee has considered the draft heat networks market framework Great Britain regulations 2025. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes of it, the ayes of it. Order, order.